recorded. So we just did audio recording for that. And it was used in the soundtrack for the piece. And this is Christopher and I toward the end of the race, a scene called Hand to Mouth, where we actually use our mouths to try to move our boxes forward. Next slide. And I hadn't planned to do a post-show discussion because I think they're often kind of lame. But what was so great is that people were like, well, we want to talk. Like, aren't you going to come talk to us? So it was like, oh, okay, all right, sure. Let's find a microphone and do it. So I thought that was really great that it was much more of a democratic, public initiated conversation rather than us, the artists, being like, and now let us explain. Next slide. This is a project called Cultural Preserves, also kind of linked to gentrification, and really with the idea that when we preserve culture, it's not just about historic buildings, but it's actually people's stories. The people are the culture. They're the cultural wealth of a city. So we'll just go through some of these slides, but you can just kind of you can just go through them now. Let's stop on this one. This is Treasure's statement. This was done at her high school in Anacostia, DC. The thing about America is there are lots of people who suffer from the effects of a single story. By that, I mean, there is a lot of stereotypes built around different races and cultures within America, which means it all started with an open-ended rumor. And so the stories, you can now keep scrolling. The stories are written and put inside of mason jars. I went to Detroit and did the same project, and then we'll stop here. But it's just about coming to a place, being able to learn from the people who live there, their stories, and then taking care with the stories. So they're symbolically placed in the mason jars, the same way we would with fruits and vegetables. And my mother is an avid jelly and jam maker, so it also connects to my personal family heritage. And this was a workshop in Detroit where we were making cyanotypes, but also, again, an opportunity for conversation about the city and how it's changing, in particular, the impact of water and being in the Detroit River. Next slide, please. So this is not a performance. This is a visual art series, but I wanted to show it because it reflects so much about my personal background. That's my father in the image, and we are in Berrien County, Georgia, where he grew up, and he was part of a sharecropping family. So he actually picked cotton from age 5 until age 15. And you can go to the next slide. And what's interesting to me is that, so I know for a fact that generations of my family have worked this very land, but we own nothing of it. But I feel like we do. It's our land, even though we don't materially own it. So this is a still from a digital video piece where my father walks through the fields and I follow behind him in his wake. Next slide. And I want to end with the final piece. It's pretty recent, from last summer, or the summer before last. It's called the Transatlantic Time Traveling Company. And it's a dance theater piece. And it's essentially what we would describe as Afrofuturist. And for me, I define it very simply as there are Black people in the future.
It seems like there was a little bit of strange audio feedback. Did other people get that? Okay, great. Yeah, maybe Holly, could you repeat yourself in that last statement?
Sure. I was just defining Afrofuturism in a very simple way as there are Black people in the future. There are more complex definitions about it as literature, as aesthetic, but that's my baseline definition. And so this piece, the Transatlantic Time Traveling Company, was performed with Jasmine Hearn and Kailasa Akil. And we play 3, we can go to the next slide. We're running a traveling medicine show in the South. But it turns out we're actually these futuristic beings who've come back to Earth to try to rid it of, let me stop my timer, of a sort of a vicious virus that creates conflict and tension and turns people against each other. So Is that the last slide? There may be one more. I think that might be the last one. But I wanted to end on that note too of, as much as it's important to discuss particular issues, I think it's also important for us to be involved in the work of world building and creating a vision for what the future might look like. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. Greatly appreciate you sharing with us about your work. So much of what you do is very resonant with me. And of course, we share some similarities in certain ways. So I'm going to share a little bit about what I do and taking a little bit of a different approach. And as a way to keep myself on time, I wrote my thing. I wrote it out because I could also run about crazily. And toward the end of my sharing, I will share 3 videos or excerpts of videos from 3 different works. So the through line in my work is actioning by doing. And I believe that embodied practices give us ways of knowing ourselves and our communities. Dance and performance in this sense becomes a vehicle for understanding complex issues around race, culture, and inclusivity. I use dance and performance as vehicles to shed light on untold stories, to share personal truths, and to show how our embodied narratives can bring us closer together. I engage in the work of linking art and social justice by reframing performance and the relationship between artists and audience. The more traditional performative setting situates the audience as voyeur, as observer. My work emphasizes collaboration, and the collaboration is extended to include the artist-audience relationship. I strive to blur the lines between the artist-audience divide and choose to engage audience as participants, collaborators in the doing and the collective work. I'm invested in the work of building community and deepening understanding as it relates to belonging by embracing and celebrating difference. I embrace and am guided by my Southern heritage as rich resources for defining an American identity shaped by hybridity, resilience, and coexistence. My work manifests at the intersection of American contemporary dance, cultural histories, and the identities of Black men. I believe that art and social justice share many things in common. One is that they are rooted in practice. They both require continuous questioning, undoing, reflecting, constructing, and remaking. In this sense, I come to my work of bridging art and social justice as being a way of life with peaks that render as shared public performance. And shared public performance designed to unlock new opportunities for self-reflecting, acquiring new knowledge, discussion, and actioning. I have created practices, choreographic landscapes, and framework from which my performance projects emerge. Choreographic landscapes, developed in 2003, infuses community members with the work as a means of blurring the lines between artists and audiences. This process creates brave and courageous spaces to share various viewpoints on difficult issues. The process for creating work includes organizing and facilitating community workshops, roundtable discussions, and building relationships and volunteering at community centers, such as a feeding and social service nonprofit for homeless individuals. The resulting performance resemble environments composed of multi-layered perspectives. This process and work identify a 13-year chapter of my career as a founder and artistic director of Edgeworks Dance Theater in Washington, DC. Ultimately, this decade-long process led me to the development of Framework, an approach that began in 2011 that centralizes recuperation and upends traditional notions of preparation for performance while creating a vulnerable and resilient body. Framework has functioned potently for 9 years, but this spring, in the wake of our pandemics, it has required a reevaluation of my assumptions about the value of vulnerability and the reality of a perpetual resilient body. This work emphasizes how actions generate sensory engagements and lived experiences. At this point, my work in bridging the arts and social justice spans 20+ years, and it has been a journey noticing how the shifting landscapes for the work has presented different ways of practicing and experiencing resistance and resilience. With that, I'm going to share a first clip from a work titled A Bon Cœur, Pages from a Journal. A Bon Cœur is a Cajun French term that means good heart, or to do wholeheartedly. It's a work that was the second installment of a trilogy project that is sparked by notions of bloodlines, memory, continuance, and legacy. The larger trilogy project is titled Ritual Gumbo, A Passage. So we'll share a little
So
video.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again and share this video. And Helanius, just tell me when to stop. And this video does have audio, and so.
So we'll watch 1 minute of the video, roughly, just to give a taste.
Great, and just stop me if you're not getting any audio on your end.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. So the Greater Project is a multi-year creative research project that reflects on how complex we are and how home is where our paths begins for a less blemished future. In its entirety, the choreographic trilogy invites us to reconnect to the importance of embracing, honoring, and celebrating difference. In its second work, this work is titled Dirt. I created it this past summer in collaboration with Roma Flowers and Andy Hasenflug. It's a screen dance that I was inspired to do as a result of the current pandemics. And it's a meditation on being a Black body in America and on the uprisings fueled by police brutality and structural racism. I'm going to share the trailer for this project with you. Awesome. And as a glimpse into the present, going into the future, I'm working on a brand new project, which is also unfolding as a multi-year project titled The Conversation Series. And we'll show a short excerpt of a rough cut of a screen dance that I'm working on at the moment. So this is not done at all, but you have the first glimpse of it. And I'll just talk over this footage. So Cal, you can share your screen and share the work. We did a 2-week rehearsal filming process for this work, and this will reflect one episode of the project, the Conversation Series. There are many ways in which this work is intersectional. I'm conjuring up a lot of different things, our different bodies. I'm bringing up concepts around our reflections on land and space. The work was shot in spillways and wheat fields. in dugouts of man-made parks on the territories of Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute Nations. So it's conjuring up all of these spaces, the stories from these spaces, sort of resuscitating experiences. And we can scroll through. There we go. So here are a couple of images from a conversation series. You can go up one more or two more. There we go. So this would be the first. And scroll into the second. And the third. And our last image, which I believe is an image in the spillway. Awesome. So this gives you a visual sense of what I'm working on right now and what's occupying my time, which is deeply rooted in finding a way to navigate our current reality and find footing, and engaging in what I believe is a way to getting to dealing with the systemic racism issue. So that's where my feet are landing right now. With that being said, circling back to Holly and pulling us into conversation mode a little bit, one of the things that I feel that we share in common is this notion of social justice and the art making with it being an ongoing practice. It's a way of life. It's not a one-time I'm dreaming up a thing to do and then it's gone. But to be able to do that thing, we actually have to live it. And I'm curious about how you're navigating this current pandemic reality and what does it mean to your work right now?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Can you all hear me? I put my headphones on. Okay, so hopefully that will cut out any static. I love that earlier you referred to pandemics, plural, and I think that's so important for us to be thinking about that. And I think about the coronavirus pandemic, but also the pandemic of anti-Blackness and ongoing white supremacy in America, right? And how it's not that there's, more violence against Black people, Black bodies right now. It's that the technology has gotten better, and that through that, there's maybe been a greater groundswell that crosses racial lines and class lines to some extent, so that more people are really, I don't know, the word that comes to mind is convicted.
Yeah.
So I have a Southern Baptist, tradition. And so I think people are finally starting to get a little bit convicted and wanting to at least let their voices be heard and to start to make a change. So in terms of, how it's affected me as an individual person, as a Black woman, as an artist, I actually think it has. So for one, a lot of things have paused. Although I did do some live stream performances, I'm going to do an in-person performance. Are we in October yet? Not quite. Next month. Still the 30th. Next month at New York Live Arts. And I'm going to be performing in a glass window. The audience is going to be outside on the sidewalk with their mask on, hopefully, and socially distanced. But I've really slowed down a lot. And I also have made some choices that to me are about my personal health, because I want to live through these pandemics. Yeah. So I didn't watch the presidential debate last night. I don't plan on watching any of them. People will tell me if there's things I need to know. And I'm okay with that. Like, previous elections, I've gotten on the phone and mailed and done this and that. And I just feel like for my health, my mental well-being, I'm removing myself from this process because it feels so much like a sham. That said, I'm going to vote. I believe voting is important.
Yeah.
And I was always raised with the idea that, our ancestors died so we could vote. And
Yes.
even if you don't like the candidates, go write your own name in. But
Yeah.
you must vote, because if none of us actually participates in democracy, then we really don't have a say,
Yeah.
So that's my answer to that question.
Yeah, it's so awesome. I hear you about slowing down. I mean, in part, it's like reality, in part, it's functioning, right? So the reality is that opportunities just stopped for us, or became postponed or canceled. But then there's this other reality of how do we and our bodies navigate this moment? What do we need to do for ourselves? And as I was listening to you talk, I keep thinking about a word that's very resonant for me in my own work, and that's recuperation, right? So what does it mean to recuperate, to like recharge, to restore oneself in order to find the footing to start again, but start again with a sort of clarity that is meaningful and thoughtful for the moment for you, and therefore become restorative versus depleting and taking away from you. And so to that extent, part of my journey required returning to the basics, if you will. I started walking over the summer, 12 miles a day. And I started to blog, which I had a blog in the past, and it was more so to do the social thing, and advertise and keep a presence. But now the blog has changed to something deeply meaningful and an avenue to unpack, and an avenue to engage in my vulnerability in a different way, but in a way that allows me space and time to really reflect and sit with my feelings, but also to let them go and not have them weigh me down. And in the whole walking process, I felt like it wasn't about walking for the sake of walking, but it was like my personal protest, because I had health concerns and I didn't want to be in the large groups of protesters, but I wanted to be aligned with them. But I was also in fear. And so I felt like walking was painful. And so I had to engage in a process to unlearn fear. And so the walking was about walking the same pathway all the time. And ultimately, after a month or so, people, and I was walking around the same time, started to recognize me, that I wasn't just someone passing through the space, but I was a member of my neighborhood. And then eventually there was like a high or a wave. And so there's acknowledgement. And all of that started to help with allowing me to exhale in a different way, and made the walking feel a bit easier, if you will. But there's still a long road. So it's like I had to go to the self and unlearn some things and relearn some things in order to find my footing back into like the conversation series or doing dirt,
Yeah. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I have many questions, but I'm just going to try to pick one or two. But thinking about your, I guess it's not a transition, but current sort of interest in dance on film, dance on camera. I'm curious for you how the ways in which that feels different than making work that's meant for live audiences, and the ways in which maybe it sort of pushes your aesthetic, because it's not just, some people do dance for camera and it's like, and here's a camera and here's a
Right.
person dancing on it.
Right.
But you're really doing collage and editing and sound and visual elements. So I'm really curious how that process has been for you creatively.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I guess I will, no pun intended, zoom back just a little bit to offer that many people do not know I have a film and video background. And in fact, I went to undergrad school for film and video before going to school for dance. And my interests have always been in multimedia and intermedia work. And the distinction between the two for me is that intermedia work centers technology. So without the technology, the project can't happen. And without the dance and all the elements in the technology can't work. So it's really in conversation with each other in a real way. But I've always had this interest of being multidisciplinary and figuring out it's almost like putting a puzzle together, that when I put the pieces together, it completes the sentence because the layering is achieved in different ways. So yeah, so that's always been like a root-based thing for me. With screen dance, it's definitely very different, but I'm holding myself to the complexity. I'm holding myself to the cultural histories. I'm holding myself to what I'm made of. So the process for making the work feels very similar to making live work, although it renders differently in that there's this component that I'm not in the room with you. And so much about what I make is about being in the room with me. It's meant to be that way. And so like I'm creating a different perspective or a different lens when I'm considering the screen dance, that you feel that you're in the room with me.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. I had a similar kind of experience when this past May, I did my first sort of new work for a live stream. And it was, again, part of this residency at New York Live Arts. And I was mad at first, it's just like, my work is about people being in a room together and we touch each other and it's exchange. And, it was like, well, you either postpone it indefinitely or you get over yourself and try to embrace live streaming. So then it became, like you said, a puzzle, a challenge to say, how can I use the technology to replicate some of the things that I appreciate most about live performance? So that sense of like call and response. So we set up a piece. It was a variation of Race Talcon Ash. And I performed it with Jasmine Hearn, who's a New York-based dancer, a member of Urban Bush Women now. And we were obviously in separate rooms, but we tried to make it look like we were adjacent. So we had similar sort of red tape on the wall and wood floor, white background. And it was set up as challenges instead of one long race that you watch. So the audience got to vote who did it best. They also got to put in prompts. And it was so awesome to see this sort of like, chat thread going crazy with people like saying hi to each other and commenting, and it really did feel a little bit live. And the other thing we did structurally is as the piece goes on, Jasmine and I get closer and closer and closer to the camera until it's actually just like our lips. And it was this way of wanting to like get closer, almost like I could almost touch you through the screen. So
I saw that work.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I did, and I absolutely loved it. It was, I will never forget the day I saw it because it was a real treat. Because it came to me at a time when I was feeling a different kind of exhaustion from everyone responding to this reality by dumping information, lots of content for free online, that it was all, and was feeling kind of cold, and it was causing me to push back a little bit and be like, I don't think I want to watch this, even though it might be great and it's beautiful to have this access from companies and of works that maybe I wouldn't typically get to see. But it was just I wanted a different way. I wanted someone to show up and say, I'm going to take this technology thing and make it a thing for this moment. And when I saw your piece, I was like, yes. And I was so happy to participate. And I was so happy to like feel like I was in the room with you. I really did feel that. And the fact that I was able to continually be invited to participate, it was really beautiful. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I don't know if we're taking.
Where moving forward, are you working on any new projects right now that is really rooted in, like, again, this reality, right? Of like, what do I do? How do I tackle it?
Right. Well, like you, I've been doing more writing.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't really shared it beyond sharing it with friends. But that's been really exciting because writing is really like one of my earliest art forms. in the same way that you have this rich film background, I pretty much was like a poet and spoken word artist, even though I was dancing the whole time. And so that's been really interesting to just feel. Also, I'm trying to put together the right words, actually, because at the beginning of the pandemic, it was very hard for me to read books.
Yeah.
And it was very hard for me to engage the written word. And so it feels like this very kind of luscious, generative space to sort of wake up and be like, oh, here's an idea for a poem. I'm just going to jot it down and, you know, and walk through the world and think of metaphors. And it's like, oh, so it's a very kind of loving internal space to occupy. And then also the piece at Live Arts. So I performed a version of it before called Moneymaker. I performed it twice, once for 5 hours, once for 7 hours. But now I'm going to perform it for 12 hours, which was actually the original vision. I always wanted to do a 12-hour piece, in part in homage to my father, who shared this story with me. I didn't learn this till I was an adult, but you know, he had this amazing day where he picked the most cotton he had ever picked, and it was 214 pounds. And he earned, the rate then was 3.5 cents per pound. So he earned $7.50, which he said was more than, you know, if you worked in a factory, you might have gotten $5 or $6 for that day. So to earn more than a factory worker doing this physical labor. But also I was like, whoa, how do you remember these specific precise numbers from when you were 15 and now you're, I think at that time he was in his late 60s when he was telling me the story. That must have been really profound. Like, of all the things that he's done that he's proud of, this is an accomplishment that he really treasures but doesn't share very often. And so I just think about that legacy of labor and resilience, as you were talking about. So I want to sort of, in some ways, in my art form and my form of labor, my labor practice is art making and movement. I want to sort of pay homage to my father's durational work. So I'm excited to see what happens. Like, if I'm still on the, you know, if I'm like on the floor for the last 2 hours, it's still a piece.
Yes, you know? Absolutely.
But I'm gonna hopefully still be standing at the end of the 12 hours.
I love that. Well, it just, I'm sorry, you just brought up one more thought around duration, as, you know, and performance, because I'm very much tied to that concept as well, in this way of making work. Like, I'm interested how things evolve over time. I'm interested in what changes. I'm interested in how we trace back and not offer a snippet or a glimpse of what it was, because then we don't necessarily always feel that, but to be there and to really endure and to make it a work or a practice where you're committing to something that maybe even feels impossible, you know, the 12 hours to do. But the reality is everything requires this certain kind of endurance. And it requires this certain kind of like staying with it, you know, like even when I brought up about the conversation series and Ryder and I's commitment. I mean, that's a real commitment, because before the pandemic, we almost felt like we had a blueprint for how to navigate the work. But then when the pandemic came in, it's like, oh, we are really being pushed into the reality of this work. We are seeing that we're going to bump up against challenges. We are seeing that our process is going to get interrupted. We are seeing that we have to figure out how to stay connected through all of that. We are seeing that we have to figure out how to make in this time. We have to figure out how to relate, even when tension might surface. So it's like the real life picture is the art piece, you know? And so I'm hearing that in your work as well. And yeah, I just feel like that speaks to that bridging of art and social justice.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love this idea that you're going to be creating episodes, and that even if you are sort of playing with the same idea or theme or concept, it's always going to be different.
Right.
And yeah, I think that's really valuable and interesting.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I feel, I don't know, Holly, you can tell me differently, but I feel like I'm ready to sort of take some
Yeah,
questions from other folks.
some
And
questions.
yeah, it just feels so familiar with you that I'm just.
Get my cup of tea and just sit.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, no, I think it would be great to open up to the audience too.
Awesome.
Thanks. It's really lovely to see you too.
Thank you.
I think we still have a fairly large group. So if folks want to take a minute, think about something they might want to ask and put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand in the chat and we can call on you.
And maybe Lisa, if you, oh, does someone ask a question? I was going to say maybe Lisa, if you have a question to help people get started.
I'll just and if anyone was like me, we were really enthralled with listening to you, and so I was really enjoying that time.
It's a mind shift.
Yeah, well, I guess it's more of a comment. I think, well, maybe it's a comment and a question. So yeah, I didn't know about Helanius, your background in film. And that makes sense, but it just makes me think about like the labels. And I noticed on both of your bios, you talked about multidisciplinary. I always struggle with this idea of like, I don't like to be labeled, and yet to get your work out there, you need to do that. And I just also wonder how that butts up against like other identities that you have and how you deal with that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, okay, Holly, you're quiet.
I can go. I actually have an answer to that question.
Okay, great.
And I feel like earlier in my career, it was this thing where like, if I knew people from my spoken word days in New York, they'd be like, oh, Holly's a poet. But then if I knew them from like Dance Place in DC, they'd be like, oh, Holly's a dancer. But I feel like it took like 10 or 15 years for people to be like, no, she does all these things.
Yeah.
And it's okay. And I think that's like parallel to even having an intersectional identity, right? Yeah. Where like people want to be like, you're Black, and someone's like, but I'm Afro-Latina. And it's like, oh, okay, that complicates things. And, so I think forging that multidisciplinary or intersectional identity just requires a lot of tending to all of the parts until other people catch up to where you are. But I think that was the big thing for me, was to be like, well, I know what I do. So I'm going to do what I do, and eventually it will coalesce.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. The word that came up for me was code switching earlier on. Like I will switch and to do the thing that I want to do in the, whatever area it exists. So I would just basically highlight a different part of me in certain environments. And then, but always with my mind and my eyes on the space, or looking for the space where I can bring all of those things together and maybe not even have to place a label on it. Because when I'm thinking about labels, I even think about bios and writing the bio, right, that's legible to the outside. Like, what does that mean? Like if I say dancer, yes, I'm a dancer, yes, I'm a choreographer, but there are all these other things that I'm interested in. And how things are perceived or received, like what's the identity of the word itself, which also comes before the identity the reason why we're using it. So
yeah. We have a question in the chat from Lara Segura, I think. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Oh, wait, I lost it.
Yeah. It's about audience engagement. You both spoke about audience engagement. What are some of the ways you encourage your audiences to become participants within the work? Thank you for that question. For me, I mean, it's manifold. I shared one example in my offering earlier around how I make the process transparent, and I invite community into the making of the work. And in doing that, there's also, it allows for a sense of ownership to some degree by bringing them into the process. But in other ways, it's maybe, I'm saying maybe, but when I think about my work in my head, most times I dismantle the fourth wall, and there's always this interaction in real time with audiences, being that I'm talking with them and trying to hold a conversation with them while I'm on stage, or it's bringing them onto the stage space with me, or it's inviting them into something that is pre-created in the way of there being a pre-community-based section. So like with A Bon Cœur, the short excerpt we saw was focused on me as soloist, but there is a section in the work where up to 25 individuals, community members, join me on stage, and we form a second line and we parade out of the theater space. So in that way, the work is always inviting audiences and community in.
Oh, I love that idea of the second line. I'll go back to my piece, Race, Talc, and Ash, which, you know, the whole idea was, one of the ideas was that I heard a quote from a arts producer, Ivan Segoda, and he said, you know, if people go to like one modern dance thing that they don't like, they just write off dance in general. Like, I don't like dance. But nobody goes to a bad movie and it's like, that's it, I'm done with movies. You know, so I feel like we have this tiny, tiny window for people who are making, you know, live dance or performance art to try to capture people. So I was like, I wish, you know, dance and performance art and this kind of abstract, odd work that I like was like sporting events where people would get excited that their favorite choreographer was coming to town and put on their team colors and like all go downtown together. So that was sort of, I was like, well, why don't I just do it? And it was so fun that people were on the sidelines cheering us on, and that they could walk around, and we had people selling Cracker Jacks, and there was this like chaos, and you didn't feel like, oh, I've got to come and sit in my seat, and if I don't like it, I'm trapped, you know. And there was something just really celebratory that I love, and I've tried to continue cultivating that energy.
Awesome. It seems like we have a couple of more questions, or maybe more than a couple, but they're flying so fast. So it's capturing.
We have a bunch. I was wondering if folks, I was going to call on Erica Eckert. Do you want to share your question?
Hi, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful session and really eye-opening for me. So I'll try and just condense what I wrote. So I come from the classical music background. I'm a classical violist, and the way that you talk about embodying experience, this is I mean, I'm sure I think about it on some level, but I don't know if you have any ideas to share or thoughts about the non-mover. You know, somebody like me. I actually take a class sometimes where I move, so I'm not completely, but I don't usually use that in my expression. It's you stand still and you perform the music, and even with what people are doing on video right now, that's sort of our mode of expression, which seems to actually really disconnect our beings, ourselves, from what we're doing. We also tend to interpret other people's music. So I guess I'm just throwing this out there in the dialogue because it's what listening to the two of you have kind of brought up for me.
Thank you for sharing. A couple of things, and maybe like I'm drifting off, but that's bubbling up for me in your sharing is one, this how I come to dance as being the universal language, or movement as a universal language. because on a daily basis, we are reading body language, that is movement. We are reading expression, self-expression through the way in which we present. And there's something about that core, raw, foundational place of accessing movement and engagement through the body that holds a real place for me. And so in saying that and making the connection to your use of the term non-dancer, and on some level, I feel like we're all dancers. We're all movers. But I also understand how the term non-dancer could be used to describe the individual who's not doing this professionally, or the individual who has not trained in a certain kind of way. But I don't know, and I'm sure Holly's going to respond to this, but for me, I love creating invitation for everyone. And most certainly in my community-based projects where I'm inviting community to engage, they are not the traditional dancer or only the traditional dancer. I generally have more members from the general population who wouldn't think that they would dance or be on stage. But it's, so in that sense, it's like what I nurture are relationships, and what I nurture is developing courageous and brave spaces where stories and voices could be heard, and that we can arrive at a place of confidence to then share in a certain kind of way.
Yeah, that was beautifully said, Helanius. Yeah, I would just add to that. I think also, again, I think we all understand what it means to be like a classically trained professional dancer, and classical not just in the sense of ballet, but in the many different art forms that require, you know, whether that's Bharatanatyam or whether that's African dance, you know, like any dance form where you really rehearse it and learn it has a virtuosity to it and has technique. But I use a lot of social dance, and I'm like a fan of this idea, like Helanius said, like we're all movers, you know, across different levels of physical ability. I think to just embrace that and not, you know, I think our world wants us to always be like, oh, I'm not a real artist, you know, and it's just like, let's let that go. Like, I do make a distinction between people who try to earn their living doing it. That's really the only distinction I think needs to be made. Like, I will say I'm a professional working artist, and that to me means something specific. Like beyond that, there's so much artistry and there's so much talent, there's so much creativity, and we do ourselves a favor when we just embrace that. And I kind of wanted to address to someone in the chat who's saying they have been feeling uncreative in the pandemic. And I think that's very real, even for working professional artists. Like you're like, oh, this is my job and I kind of can't do it right now. You know, it's like, I can't read, I can't dance. I like, at the beginning especially, it's like, I can listen to music and sleep. Like that's where I am. And I just think being gentle with ourselves and taking the time to come back to small moments of joy. That's where I found my creativity. Again, it's like, but there was a lot of numbness and there was a lot of chaos in my brain, and there was a lot of not feeling creative and feeling, you know, depressed, frankly, anxious, exhausted. And none of those help creativity. Like, I'm not someone who's like, I need to be like sad to make art. Like, that's not actually most people. So, you know, it helps to be well rested and to feel loved and to be generative. And that's what creativity, I think, requires. But it's also okay to be gentle with ourselves and like just trust that the creative flow will come back.
Yeah. So true. Lisa, are you eyeing?
Lisa, do you want to pick another question for us? You got to unmute yourself, friend.
Thanks. I realized that you're right. I'm sorry, I had skipped over Katie's question, but I think maybe you just addressed that. So Katie, if you want us to come back to it, we can. But there was another question from Kate. Okay, Katie says thank you. From Kate Mattingly, and I wondered if she wanted to voice that question.
I think it's clear in the chat, and I would just love to hear Helanius and Holly speak to this if they want to. And huge thank you for this. It's really awesome.
Cool. Let's see.
Hi, Kate. It's so good to hear your voice.
Yeah.
I think about your question a lot, and I think we should probably read it out.
I can read it. Sorry.
Oh, thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
Being on mute when I'm trying to talk. Okay, so the question was, listening to both Holly and Helanius describe their projects, Kate started thinking about social practice and relational aesthetics as genres that are considered relatively recent in the arts, but how these practices have existed for centuries within communities of color and among Indigenous peoples. And so Kate wondered if either Holly or Helanius had ideas about this, and that she loves how both of them create projects that intervene in these conversations.
So it just reminds me of an anecdote. I heard Melvin Van Peebles talk about his movie Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song?
Yeah, I think so.
But you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's what it is.
So, and it was this conference on surrealism, and he was like, well, I don't know. We weren't trying to be surreal. We didn't know it was surrealism. We were just doing what felt true to us. You know, and I think that's how I feel when I started reading about social practice. I was like, well, if I haven't been doing this for 15 years, if I haven't been doing this my whole life, if I didn't grow up in a church with a dance team that was already doing this when I was 12 years old. So it was this funny thing where I was like, oh, this is the term that, you know, sort of like the dominant art establishment has now sort of granted validity and credence to this practice that my communities that I was raised in, and that I attribute as much of my artistry to that as like my, you know, ballet lessons and a little dance studio. It's what we were doing all along. But okay, and if it helps me get a grant, then I'm totally fine with using that language. And I do, but like at the same time that I have that awareness of this, you know, academic theory, my sort of heart is rooted in just being connected to audiences and communities who I don't think care that much about relational aesthetics. So I you know, it's that thing of like, I think it's important to have the academic framing, and it's what you were talking about, Helanius. Actually, it's another form of code switching.
Yeah.
But yeah, I absolutely was like, oh, I know how to do this. It's what I've been doing, and all my people have been doing. So yeah, this is kind of funny to me in that regard.
Yeah. Ditto. I don't know if I could say that any better. I think the one thing I would add is just, which you've also already covered, but saying it in a different way, there's something about the catching up, right? That everything is truly, or so many things are truly in practice, in motion, a way of life. But that moment of catching up is when a term is given to it. And maybe it's even about who gives it the term to then make it valid, right? Because if a certain individual is not giving it the term, is it still being acknowledged as a thing? So I'm wondering about that as well, like who gets permission to name it and to elevate it, if you will, or bring it into the public eye? Who gets permission to pull it out of the community and say it's a thing? Who gets permission, right? And then what does it mean on the other side once that permission is given in terms of the practicing of it and the continuation of it? Is that when we go into co-opting? Is that when we go into appropriation? Like all of what's happening needs to be looked at, because it's super complex.
Thank you for that answer, both of you. We have another, Mary. Mary, do you want to? I can't really see everybody, so Mary, are you out there? Well, okay. I'm not seeing her, but she asked, it was more of a comment than a question, but yeah, okay. She loved what you said about unlearning fear through walking and would love to hear you talk more about that.
Yeah, the languaging of practice is really real for me. And to do anything, I feel it requires that I have to be with it. And I have to be with it for a long time, and I have to figure out how to do it. And I'm going to use this sort of metaphor in relationship to dance, so that when I'm teaching classes to students all the time, I said, you know, take a basic step, a tendu, stretching of your foot, and today you might be amazing. That point might be a real thing, but then tomorrow you'll come in and you can't stretch your foot. Like, you have to figure out how to do it again. So there's this constant learning and relearning, and undoing to do again. And in terms of unlearning fear for me, it is speaking a little bit about that everything I've come to understand about life and about existence and about being a Black man in America, being a Black man in the world, being a Black queer artist, I arrive at a place that gives me a certain kind of confidence. And then at that same mark is also when I go into a space of having to ask a lot more questions, to figure out how to continue to exist and continue to move forward. So the learning continues. So there's this ongoing practice, and that practice for me is living, and repeatedly inviting what might seem basic, because it's really far more complex. It's kind of, yeah.
Yeah, that makes me think a lot about how the conversation kind of began when you were saying that, social justice as a way of life.
Yep.
And this walking as a practice, this walking to remove fear as a similar kind of practice, that it's not about a final endpoint or a journey, but it's actually about the moment,
Right.
itself. Yeah.
And at that moment, like, it could be a really long moment, or it could be a short moment, yeah. So the relationship to time is also changing in that process.
Oh, this is a little bit unrelated, but would it be okay for us to share your blog? I could share a link to your blog.
Sure. It exists on my website, and my website is www.helaniusj.com. And my name is spelled Helanius, if anyone needs that.
Can you write it in the chat, Helanius?
Sure, I could totally do that as well. I was being like a little lazy.
Oh, Emmanuel's got
somebody
it in
put
there.
it in. Perfect.
Woohoo! Okay.
Holly, we might have had a link to yours but
it's just my name. That's my website, and it's I need to update it, but you can still see up until about like 2018. But I haven't put the last year's works on there. Yeah.
Doesn't need to update their website. Well, maybe.
I know, right?
That's a practice. It's a process.
It is a practice. I was up doing it until the past year got away from me, but it's gonna happen soon.
Yeah.
Hopefully we're gonna refresh.
Absolutely.
When you were just talking about the practice and process, it was reminding me of that book, the Miles Horton and Paulo Freire, We Make the Road by Walking, a conversation book.
Yeah.
I love a conversation book from you guys, or I guess just more conversation. It was just really, really great to hear you two talking with each other.
Thank you.
I feel like it's something about the I've always been kind of fascinated by conversation, and I think that something about listening to people talk to each other, I feel like is more meaningful than being talked at. So really appreciate getting to entree into that. Ellen, did you have a question? Oh, no, okay.
I'm just enjoying the conversation, and it's not a question, it's just relating. And so when people were asking about audience, and I have the honor to be part of Helena's Multiscapes, and that was lovely. And I was literally in tears because the audience was sitting there, and when he was pulling the rope and people following, and I feel like we are all into the journey together. And so that's part of the choreography, and that's part of the story. And the same thing, like in the end of the performance, like we didn't have a public artist speak or whatever, but everybody want to talk. We put out whiteboards for people to write and do things, and people just hang out for a long time because people wanted to talk. And so I love Holly, you using the quote about, yes, artist's job is to make it irresistible. People want to do something and want to talk about it. And I think both of your work, I saw that, and I feel very lucky and fortunate to be able to see that and feel that and experience that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Helen, it's so great to see you. Thank you. It's really so great. And we're going to do a lot more work together. So stay tuned. There are more projects coming from us.
Well, Ellen, I think that was maybe the best way to end tonight with that really lovely sharing. Thank you. Unless either of you want to share anything else, we are at time. And this was just so fantastic.
I just want to say thank you for everyone who making the time and space to be with us. Community, again, is just so important to me, and there are a plethora of ways in which we build community. And most certainly we've built one this evening, and we've built a brave and courageous sharing space. And I just, I really thank you. I don't feel like Holly and I were speaking, but I feel like we were actually in conversation with everyone the entire time. So I'm just grateful for that.
Yeah, thank you all. It's been lovely.